Marcus Johnson pulled into the driveway of his newly purchased home on Maple Street, a quiet suburban neighborhood that seemed perfect for starting fresh. After years of saving and working double shifts at the tech company downtown, he had finally achieved his dream of homeownership. The two-story colonial house with its neat front lawn and white picket fence represented everything he had worked toward. As he stepped out of his car, Marcus noticed a woman across the street watching him intently. She was middle-aged with perfectly styled blonde hair and wore a crisp white blouse that looked like it had never seen a wrinkle. Her arms were crossed and her expression suggested she was not pleased about something. Marcus gave a friendly wave, but the woman simply turned and walked back into her house without acknowledging him. Marcus shrugged off the cold reception and began unloading boxes from his car. Moving was exhausting, but he was excited to finally have a place to call his own. The previous owners had left the house in excellent condition, and Marcus was looking forward to making some personal touches to turn it into a real home. That evening, as Marcus was setting up his home office, he realized he needed to change the Wi-Fi password. The previous owners had left their network active with a generic password, and Marcus wanted to secure his connection properly. Being a cybersecurity specialist, he knew how important it was to maintain good digital hygiene. He pulled out his laptop and logged into the router's admin panel to update the network settings. The next morning, Marcus was awakened by aggressive knocking on his front door. He glanced at his phone and saw it was barely 7 in the morning. Still in his pajamas, he made his way downstairs and peered through the peephole. The woman from across the street was standing on his porch, and she did not look happy. Marcus opened the door cautiously, keeping the chain lock engaged. The woman immediately began speaking in a loud, demanding tone that carried across the quiet neighborhood. She introduced herself as Patricia Whitmore, the president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, and claimed there had been suspicious activity reported at his address. Patricia demanded to know what Marcus had been doing on his computer the previous evening. She insisted that neighbors had seen him tampering with electronic devices, and claimed this violated several HOA regulations about unauthorized modifications to property systems. Marcus was confused by her accusations and tried to explain that he had simply been changing his own Wi-Fi password. But Patricia cut him off. She pulled out a thick folder filled with HOA documents and began reading various rules and regulations in a stern voice. According to Patricia, any modifications to electronic systems required prior approval from the HOA board, and failure to comply could result in significant fines. Marcus tried to reason with her, explaining that changing a Wi-Fi password was basic home security, but Patricia was unmoved. The situation escalated when Patricia noticed Marcus's laptop bag visible through the doorway. She demanded to inspect his computer equipment, claiming she needed to verify he was not running any unauthorized servers or engaging in suspicious online activities that might violate neighborhood standards. Marcus firmly refused, explaining that his personal devices were none of her business. Patricia's voice grew louder and more aggressive. She threatened Marcus with immediate HOA violations and mentioned that she had connections who could make his life in the neighborhood very difficult. Several neighbors had come outside to see what the commotion was about, and Marcus felt embarrassed by the public spectacle Patricia was creating. When Marcus continued to refuse her demands for access to his property and devices, Patricia pulled out her phone and announced she was calling the police. She claimed that Marcus was being uncooperative with lawful HOA authority, and that his suspicious electronic activities warranted immediate investigation by law enforcement. Marcus was stunned by the escalation. He had done nothing wrong except change his own Wi-Fi password, yet this woman was treating him like a criminal. He tried once more to explain the situation calmly, but Patricia was already dialing 911 with dramatic gestures that seemed designed to attract even more attention from the gathering neighbors. As Patricia spoke to the emergency dispatcher, Marcus could hear her exaggerating the situation significantly. She described unauthorized computer activities and refusal to comply with community safety protocols in a way that made it sound like Marcus was engaged in something illegal. She repeatedly emphasized that she was the HOA president and that this was an urgent community safety matter. Marcus retreated into his house and quickly got dressed, knowing the police would arrive soon. He gathered his identification documents and tried to prepare for what he assumed would be a brief conversation to clear up the misunderstanding. As a law-abiding citizen with no criminal record, he was confident the police would quickly see that Patricia's complaints were baseless. However, as he waited for the officers to arrive, Marcus began to feel a familiar sense of dread. He had experienced similar situations before where minor incidents had been blown out of proportion, and he worried about how this encounter might unfold. Despite his professional success and clean record, he knew that first impressions and assumptions could sometimes override facts. Through his window, Marcus could see Patricia pacing on his front lawn, still talking loudly to neighbors and pointing at his house. She seemed to be building a case against him with anyone who would listen, describing his behavior in increasingly dramatic terms. Some neighbors appeared skeptical of her claims, but others nodded along with her concerns. The sound of sirens approaching in the distance signaled that this morning was about to become much more complicated than Marcus had ever imagined. What had started as a simple Wi-Fi password change was now involving law enforcement, and Marcus could not help but wonder how such a routine task had led to this surreal confrontation with his new neighbor. He took a deep breath and prepared to face whatever came next, hoping that common sense would prevail once the officers heard the full story. 2 police cruisers pulled up to Marcus's house within minutes of each other, their red and blue lights flashing and drawing even more attention from curious neighbors. Officer Rodriguez, a veteran cop with a calm demeanor, stepped out of the first vehicle while his younger partner, Officer Chen, emerged from the second car. Both officers surveyed the scene as Patricia immediately rushed toward them, waving her HOA folder dramatically. Patricia launched into a detailed complaint about Marcus's suspicious activities before the officers had even reached the front door. She described seeing him manipulating computer equipment late into the evening and claimed he had refused to cooperate with lawful HOA inspections. Officer Bay Rodriguez listened patiently while taking notes, though his expression suggested he was not entirely convinced by Patricia's urgent tone. Marcus opened his front door before the officers knocked, hoping to demonstrate his willingness to cooperate. He greeted the officers respectfully and invited them to come inside to discuss the situation privately. Patricia attempted to follow them into the house, but Officer Rodriguez politely but firmly asked her to wait outside while they conducted their initial investigation. Inside the house, Marcus calmly explained what had actually happened. He showed the officers his laptop and demonstrated how he had logged into his router to change the Wi-Fi password. Officer Chen, who was more tech-savvy than his partner, immediately understood that this was a routine security practice that any responsible homeowner would perform. Marcus also provided his identification and explained that he was a cybersecurity professional who had recently purchased the house. Officer Rodriguez asked Marcus about his interaction with Patricia that morning. Marcus described how she had demanded access to his personal devices and threatened him with HOA violations when he refused. He emphasized that he had been polite but firm in protecting his privacy rights, which seemed to be what had triggered Patricia's call to 911. The officers asked to see Marcus's router and the network settings he had changed. Marcus willingly showed them everything, explaining each step of the password change process. Officer Chen confirmed that nothing Marcus had done was unusual or suspicious, and both officers began to realize they were dealing with a significant overreaction from the HOA president. When the officers went back outside to speak with Patricia, her story began to change slightly. She now claimed that Marcus had been evasive about his activities and had refused to show proper documentation of his right to modify the property's systems. She insisted that the HOA had legitimate authority to inspect electronic equipment that might affect the neighborhood's shared infrastructure. Officer Rodriguez asked Patricia to show him the specific HOA regulations that gave her the authority to inspect residents' personal computers and networking equipment. As Patricia fumbled through her folder of documents, it became clear that no such authority existed. The rules she was citing dealt with exterior property modifications and had nothing to do with personal electronic devices or Wi-Fi networks. Several neighbors had gathered to watch the proceedings, and Officer Chen began interviewing them about what they had actually observed. Most confirmed that they had seen Marcus moving boxes and setting up his home office, but none had witnessed anything remotely suspicious. One neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, mentioned that Patricia had been asking questions about Marcus since the day he moved in, suggesting her complaints might be motivated by something other than genuine security concerns. Meanwhile, Patricia's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. When the officers challenged her interpretation of the HOA rules, she raised her voice and demanded to speak with their supervisor. She insisted that as HOA president, she had special authority in community matters and suggested the officers were not taking her concerns seriously enough. Officer Rodriguez remained professional but began to lose patience with Patricia's demands. He explained that changing a Wi-Fi password was not a crime, and that homeowners had the right to secure their personal networks without HOA approval. Patricia responded by claiming that Marcus's refusal to cooperate was itself suspicious and warranted further investigation. The situation took an interesting turn when Officer Chen asked Marcus about his professional background. When Marcus mentioned he worked in cybersecurity for a major downtown company, the officer asked if he had ever encountered cases involving network security violations. Marcus explained that he regularly dealt with corporate security audits and was well versed in both legal and illegal computer activities. Patricia overheard this conversation and seemed to panic slightly. She quickly changed her approach and claimed she was only trying to protect the neighborhood from potential cyber threats. However, her lack of technical knowledge became apparent when she began mixing up basic computer terms and making claims about network security that made no sense to anyone with actual technical expertise. Officer Rodriguez asked Marcus if he would be willing to explain to Patricia exactly what he had done with his Wi-Fi settings, hoping to resolve the misunderstanding through education. Marcus agreed and patiently walked Patricia through the process of changing a network password, explaining why it was important for security and how it had no impact on anyone else's internet access. However, instead of accepting this explanation, Patricia doubled down on her complaints. She insisted that Marcus should have sought HOA approval before making any changes, and threatened to file formal violations against him, regardless of what the police determined. Her stubborn refusal to acknowledge that she was wrong began to irritate even the more sympathetic neighbors who had initially supported her concerns. As the morning wore on, it became clear that Patricia was not interested in resolving the situation reasonably. Officer Chen suggested that everyone involved take some time to cool down and try to work things out as neighbors. He advised Patricia that filing false police reports was a serious matter and encouraged her to focus on actual community issues rather than personal disputes. The officers prepared to leave, having determined that no crime had been committed and no further police action was necessary. However, as they walked toward their patrol cars, Patricia made one final demand that surprised everyone present. She insisted that Marcus provide her with his new Wi-Fi password so she could monitor his internet activity for potential security threats to the neighborhood. This outrageous request prompted Officer Rodriguez to have a stern conversation with Patricia about privacy rights and the limits of HOA authority. Marcus watched in amazement as the woman who had called 911 on him for changing his own password now demanded access to that same password for her own purposes. The irony was not lost on anyone present, and several neighbors began to openly question Patricia's motives and judgment. After the police officers departed, Marcus hoped the situation would finally settle down, but Patricia seemed more determined than ever to cause problems. She spent the rest of the day going door to door in the neighborhood, trying to rally support for what she called a comprehensive security review of Marcus's activities. Most neighbors politely declined to get involved, but Patricia was persistent in her campaign. That evening, Marcus received an official-looking letter slipped under his front door. It was from the Meadowbrook Estates HOA, signed by Patricia in her capacity as president, citing multiple alleged violations of community standards. The letter demanded that Marcus appear before the HOA board the following week to address his unauthorized modifications to property, systems, and failure to cooperate with community safety protocols. Marcus read through the letter carefully, noting how Patricia had twisted the morning's events to make them sound like serious infractions. She had also added new complaints that seemed to come from nowhere, including allegations about excessive electronic equipment and potential interference with neighboring properties. It was clear that Patricia was escalating the conflict. Rather than letting it go, the next morning, Marcus decided to take a proactive approach. As a cybersecurity professional, he understood the importance of documentation and evidence. He began researching the HOA's actual rules and regulations, as well as looking into Patricia's background as president. What he discovered was quite interesting and concerning. Marcus found that Patricia had been HOA president for over 8 years, which was unusual given that most neighborhoods rotated leadership more frequently. He also discovered that several previous homeowners had filed complaints about her overreach and inappropriate use of authority. Most telling was a series of online reviews and neighborhood forum posts describing similar confrontations Patricia had initiated with other residents. As Marcus dug deeper into public records, he uncovered something that shocked him. Patricia's own property had several unpermitted modifications that violated both city codes and HOA regulations. Her backyard shed exceeded size limits. Her driveway had been expanded without approval, and she had installed outdoor lighting that exceeded the neighborhood's brightness standards. The hypocrisy was staggering. More importantly, Marcus discovered that Patricia was not actually the legitimate HOA president. According to the association's bylaws, presidents were supposed to be elected every 2 years, but no elections had been held in the past 4 years. Patricia had simply continued acting as president without proper authorization, essentially running the HOA as her personal fiefdom. Marcus also found evidence that Patricia had been misusing HOA funds. Bank records that were supposed to be available to all homeowners showed questionable expenses that appeared to benefit Patricia personally. There were payments to contractors who had worked on her property, landscaping services that seemed to focus primarily on her yard, and other expenditures that raised serious questions about financial impropriety. The most disturbing discovery came when Marcus accessed the neighborhood's shared network infrastructure. As someone with professional network security experience, he was able to identify that someone had been attempting to monitor other residents' internet activity. The unauthorized network monitoring equipment was sophisticated and expensive, suggesting it was not the work of a casual snoop. Marcus traced the monitoring equipment back to Patricia's house, where she had apparently installed devices capable of intercepting Wi-Fi signals from neighboring properties. This explained her unusual interest in his Wi-Fi password and her claims about network security. Patricia had been conducting illegal surveillance of her neighbors' online activities for months, possibly years. Armed with this evidence, Marcus realized he was dealing with someone who was not just difficult, but potentially dangerous. Patricia's obsession with controlling and monitoring her neighbors went far beyond typical HOA overreach into criminal territory. Her targeting of Marcus for changing his Wi-Fi password now made perfect sense. He had unknowingly disrupted her surveillance operation. Marcus carefully documented everything he had found, creating a comprehensive file of Patricia's violations, illegal activities, and abuse of authority. He also discovered that several other neighbors had been victims of Patricia's surveillance but had not realized it. The scope of her misconduct was much larger than anyone had imagined. The following day, Marcus received another letter from Patricia, this one even more aggressive than the first. She was now threatening legal action if he did not comply with her demands, including providing access to his home network and computer equipment. She also claimed to have evidence of his suspicious activities and warned that she would share this information with law enforcement if necessary. Marcus realized that Patricia was becoming increasingly desperate and unpredictable. Her threats were escalating, and her behavior suggested someone who was losing control of a situation she had previously managed through intimidation and manipulation. He began to worry about what she might do next, especially given her apparent willingness to lie to police and file false reports. That weekend, Marcus decided to reach out to other neighbors who had been affected by Patricia's behavior. He started with Mrs. Thompson, who had seemed sympathetic during the police incident. When he shared some of his findings about Patricia's unauthorized surveillance, Mrs. Thompson was shocked but not entirely surprised. Mrs. Thompson revealed that she had long suspected Patricia of snooping around properties when residents were away. There had been incidents of Patricia claiming to check for security issues that seemed like excuses to gather information about neighbors' personal lives. She also mentioned that Patricia often seemed to know details about residents' activities that she should not have had access to. Other neighbors began coming forward with their own stories about Patricia's inappropriate behavior. Mr. Davis described how Patricia had demanded access to his garage to inspect his workshop equipment. The Chen family mentioned that Patricia had questioned their teenage son extensively about his after-school activities and had even followed him home from school on several occasions. As Marcus compiled these accounts, a pattern emerged of systematic harassment and surveillance that had been going on for years. Patricia had created an atmosphere of fear and intimidation in the neighborhood, using her position as HOA president to justify increasingly intrusive behavior. Most residents had simply accepted her conduct as an unfortunate but unavoidable part of living in the community. Marcus realized that his Wi-Fi password incident had been the catalyst that could finally expose Patricia's illegal activities and abuse of power. However, he also understood that confronting someone with so much to hide could be dangerous. Patricia had already shown she was willing to lie to police and make false accusations. There was no telling how far she might go to protect herself from exposure. Marcus knew he needed professional help to handle the situation properly. As a cybersecurity expert, he understood the legal implications of unauthorized network monitoring and knew that Patricia's activities constituted serious federal crimes. He decided to contact the FBI's Cybercrime Division to report the illegal surveillance he had uncovered. Special Agent Sarah Martinez from the FBI's Cyber Division was immediately interested in Marcus's report. Network surveillance of private citizens without proper authorization was a violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and several other federal statutes. Agent Martinez arranged to meet with Marcus at his home to examine the evidence he had gathered. During their meeting, Agent Martinez was impressed by the thoroughness of Marcus's documentation. His professional background had enabled him to collect evidence in a way that would be admissible in court, and his technical analysis of Patricia's surveillance equipment was precise and detailed. The FBI agent confirmed that Patricia's activities were indeed criminal and warranted a full investigation. Agent Martinez explained that cases involving neighborhood surveillance often revealed larger patterns of abuse and harassment. She was particularly concerned about Patricia's position as HOA president and how she had used that authority to gain access to residents' personal information. The FBI would need to interview other neighbors and examine Patricia's financial records to determine the full scope of her illegal activities. While the FBI began their investigation, Patricia continued her campaign against Marcus. She had scheduled the HOA board meeting for that Thursday evening and was telling neighbors that Marcus posed a serious security threat to the community. Her rhetoric was becoming increasingly inflammatory, and she seemed to be trying to turn the neighborhood against him before he could expose her misconduct. Marcus received support from an unexpected source when he was contacted by David Kim, a local attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. Mr. Kim had heard about the situation from Mrs. Thompson, who was his neighbor in an adjacent subdivision. The attorney was intrigued by the case and offered to represent Marcus pro bono, as he had been looking for an opportunity to challenge HOA overreach in court. David Kim reviewed all of Marcus's evidence and was amazed by what Patricia had been getting away with over the years. The attorney explained that Patricia's unauthorized continuation as HOA president made all of her recent actions legally invalid. More importantly, her surveillance activities opened her up to both criminal prosecution and substantial civil liability. The attorney advised Marcus to attend the HOA board meeting, but to remain calm and factual in his responses to Patricia's accusations. David would accompany him to ensure that proper legal procedures were followed and to document any additional misconduct that occurred during the meeting. On Thursday evening, Marcus and his attorney arrived at the community center where HOA meetings were typically held. They were surprised to find that Patricia had moved the meeting to her own home and had not properly notified all homeowners of the location change. This procedural violation was another sign that Patricia was operating outside the bounds of legitimate HOA authority. Only about a dozen residents had found their way to Patricia's house for the meeting, and most seemed confused about why they were there. Patricia had prepared an elaborate presentation about community security threats that featured photos of Marcus's house and wild speculation about his activities. She claimed to have evidence of suspicious network traffic and unauthorized electronic devices. When Marcus was called upon to respond to Patricia's accusations, he remained calm and professional. He explained that he had simply changed his Wi-Fi password for security reasons, and that this was standard practice recommended by all cybersecurity experts. He also noted that Patricia had never actually seen him do anything suspicious, despite her dramatic claims. Patricia became visibly agitated when Marcus questioned her authority to inspect residents' personal electronic equipment. She insisted that as HOA president, she had broad powers to ensure community safety. However, when David Kim asked her to cite the specific bylaw that granted such authority, Patricia could not provide a satisfactory answer. The attorney then raised questions about Patricia's own compliance with HOA regulations. He pointed out that her property had several unpermitted modifications and asked why she had not sought board approval for her own changes. Patricia deflected by claiming that her modifications were grandfathered in, but she could not provide documentation to support this claim. The meeting took a dramatic turn when David Kim announced that new evidence had come to light regarding unauthorized surveillance activities in the neighborhood. He did not name Patricia directly, but explained that residents had the right to know if their electronic communications were being monitored illegally. Several neighbors looked shocked and began asking questions about what kind of surveillance was taking place. Patricia immediately tried to shut down this line of discussion, claiming it was outside the scope of the meeting. However, Mr. Davis stood up and demanded to know if someone had been spying on residents' internet activity. When Patricia refused to answer directly, the room erupted in concerned voices as neighbors began to piece together what might have been happening. Mrs. Thompson asked Patricia directly if she had been monitoring residents' online activities. Patricia's response was evasive and defensive, which only increased the suspicions of those present. She claimed that any monitoring would have been for community safety purposes and was within her authority as HOA president. David Kim then dropped the bombshell that Patricia was not actually the legitimate HOA president, as no proper elections had been held in 4 years. This revelation stunned the neighbors, many of whom had assumed Patricia's authority was legitimate. The attorney explained that all of Patricia's recent actions, including the violations she had cited against Marcus, were legally invalid. The meeting devolved into chaos as residents began demanding answers about Patricia's unauthorized surveillance and illegitimate presidency. Patricia tried to maintain control by shouting over the crowd and threatening to call the police again. But the neighbors were no longer intimidated by her tactics. Several residents announced that they would be contacting their own attorneys to investigate potential privacy violations and financial impropriety within the HOA. Mrs. Thompson suggested that the neighborhood needed to hold proper elections immediately and conduct a full audit of the association's finances and activities. As the meeting broke up in discord, Patricia made one final desperate attempt to salvage the situation. She announced that she would be filing criminal charges against Marcus for network hacking and interfering with community security systems. This threat only further damaged her credibility, as most neighbors now understood that Marcus had been the victim, not the perpetrator of the neighborhood's problems. Marcus left the meeting feeling vindicated but concerned about Patricia's increasingly erratic behavior. Her threats were becoming more extreme, and her desperation suggested she might attempt even more drastic measures to avoid facing consequences for her illegal activities. The FBI investigation was proceeding, but Marcus worried about what Patricia might do before law enforcement could take action. The morning after the disastrous HOA meeting, Marcus woke to find his car's tires had been slashed and graffiti spray-painted on his garage door. The vandalism included messages like "Move Out" and "Community Threat" in bright red paint. Marcus immediately called the police and documented everything with photographs. Before touching anything, Officer Rodriguez arrived quickly and was clearly frustrated to be dealing with another incident involving Marcus and Patricia. However, when he saw the extent of the vandalism and heard about the previous evening's HOA meeting, his attitude shifted. The escalation from noise complaints to property destruction was concerning, and the officer began treating this as a serious criminal matter. Marcus's security cameras had captured footage of someone approaching his property around 3 in the morning, but the person was wearing dark clothing and a hood that obscured their face. However, the footage did show someone of Patricia's approximate height and build, and the vandal seemed familiar with the layout of Marcus's property. Agent Martinez from the FBI arrived at Marcus's house while the police were still processing the crime scene. She explained that the timing of the vandalism, so soon after Marcus had exposed Patricia's surveillance activities, was likely not coincidental. The FBI was now treating this as potential witness intimidation in connection with their ongoing cybercrime investigation. The vandalism had an unintended consequence for Patricia. Instead of intimidating Marcus into leaving the neighborhood, it galvanized other residents who were appalled by the destructive behavior. Several neighbors came forward to offer support and to share their own experiences with Patricia's harassment and intimidation tactics. Mrs. Thompson organized an emergency neighborhood meeting for that evening, this time held at the community center with proper notification to all residents. The purpose was to discuss the vandalism, address concerns about the HOA's leadership, and plan for legitimate elections to replace Patricia as president. By evening, nearly every household in the subdivision was represented at the community center. The mood was serious and concerned, with many residents expressing shock at learning about the surveillance activities and financial irregularities that had been uncovered. Several neighbors who had previously supported Patricia were now questioning their loyalty. David Kim, Marcus's attorney, addressed the gathering to explain the legal situation. He outlined how Patricia's unauthorized continuation as president invalidated her recent actions and how the surveillance activities constituted federal crimes. He also explained that residents who had been victims of illegal monitoring might be entitled to financial compensation through civil lawsuits. The revelation that prompted the most outrage was when Marcus demonstrated how Patricia's surveillance equipment worked. Using a portable network analyzer, he showed residents how their Wi-Fi networks had been compromised and their internet activity monitored. Many neighbors were horrified to learn that their private communications, banking activities, and personal browsing had potentially been observed without their consent. Mr. Davis stood up and angrily described how Patricia had questioned his teenage daughter about her online activities, suggesting she had been using surveillance data to gather information about families. The Chen family shared similar concerns about Patricia's inappropriate interest in their children's internet usage and social media activities. The financial audit that David Kim had requested revealed even more problems. Patricia had been using HOA funds for personal expenses, including landscaping for her own property, repairs to her house, and even personal travel that she had claimed was for HOA conferences. The total amount of misappropriated funds exceeded $50,000 over the past 5 years. As the evidence mounted, residents began demanding immediate action. Mrs. Thompson proposed holding emergency elections within 2 weeks to select new HOA leadership. She also suggested hiring an independent management company to oversee the association's finances and ensure proper procedures were followed in the future. Patricia did not attend the emergency meeting, despite being notified along with all other residents. Her absence was noted by many neighbors who felt she should at least attempt to defend her actions or apologize for her misconduct. Some residents drove by her house after the meeting and noticed that her surveillance equipment was being hastily removed under cover of darkness. The next morning brought more concerning developments. Several neighbors reported that their home security systems had been tampered with overnight, and Mrs. Thompson discovered that someone had attempted to break into her mailbox. The pattern of harassment and intimidation was escalating, and residents were becoming genuinely fearful for their safety. Agent Martinez met with the neighborhood watch coordinator to discuss additional security measures while the FBI investigation continued. She explained that suspects in cybercrime cases sometimes became desperate when they realized the scope of evidence against them, leading to increasingly erratic behavior. Marcus received an anonymous letter that morning that was clearly from Patricia, though she had not signed it. The letter contained wild accusations about Marcus being part of a conspiracy to destroy the neighborhood and threatened unspecified consequences if he did not drop his complaints and move away immediately. David Kim advised Marcus to take the threatening letter seriously and to consider staying elsewhere temporarily while law enforcement built their case against Patricia. However, Marcus was determined not to be driven from his home by intimidation tactics. He installed additional security cameras and arranged for friends to check on his property regularly. The situation reached a turning point when the FBI executed a search warrant at Patricia's house. Agents discovered an extensive collection of surveillance equipment, including devices capable of intercepting phone calls, emails, and text messages. They also found detailed files on virtually every neighbor, containing personal information that could only have been obtained through illegal monitoring. Most shocking was Patricia's discovery of a hit list of residents she considered problems for the neighborhood. Marcus's name was at the top of the list, followed by Mrs. Thompson and several other neighbors who had questioned her authority over the years. The list included detailed notes about each person's vulnerabilities and strategies for forcing them to move away. The search also uncovered evidence that Patricia had been selling residents' personal information to third parties, including marketing companies and identity thieves. The scope of her criminal enterprise was far beyond what anyone had imagined, and the FBI realized they were dealing with someone who had been operating an illegal surveillance and data theft operation for years. As news of the FBI raid spread through the neighborhood, residents were both relieved and terrified. Patricia had been even more dangerous than they had realized, and many families began to understand how much their privacy and security had been compromised. The community would need time to heal from the betrayal of trust and the violation of their most basic rights to privacy and safety in their own homes. Patricia Whitmore was arrested at her home during the FBI raid and charged with multiple federal crimes, including violations of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit electronic surveillance. The evidence against her was overwhelming, with terabytes of illegally obtained data found on her computer, systems and detailed records of her surveillance activities spanning nearly 6 years. The arrest sent shockwaves through the Meadowbrook Estates community. Many residents had never imagined that their seemingly overzealous HOA president was actually running a sophisticated criminal operation from her home. The full extent of Patricia's surveillance network was revealed during the investigation, showing that she had monitored virtually every household in the neighborhood and several adjacent communities. Marcus felt a mixture of relief and vindication as he watched Patricia being led away in handcuffs. What had started as a simple Wi-Fi password change had uncovered one of the largest residential surveillance operations the FBI had ever investigated. Agent Martinez later told him that his technical expertise and careful documentation had been crucial in building the case against Patricia. The legal proceedings moved quickly due to the strength of the evidence. Patricia's attorney attempted to negotiate a plea deal, but federal prosecutors were determined to pursue the maximum penalties given the scope and duration of her crimes. The case drew national media attention as an example of how HOA authority could be abused and the importance of cybersecurity awareness in residential communities. During Patricia's trial, dozens of neighbors testified about the harassment and intimidation they had experienced under her leadership. The prosecution painted a picture of someone who had systematically violated residents' privacy rights and used her position of trust to commit serious crimes against the very people she was supposed to serve. The financial investigation revealed that Patricia had stolen over $200,000 from HOA funds over the years, much more than initially estimated. She had also earned substantial income by selling residents' personal information to various criminal enterprises, including credit card fraud rings and identity theft operations. Marcus was recognized as a key witness in the case, and his professional testimony about the technical aspects of Patricia's surveillance operation was crucial in helping the jury understand the complexity and illegality of her activities. The prosecutor described him as a hero who had uncovered a dangerous criminal enterprise that could have continued for years without detection. Patricia was ultimately sentenced to 12 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution of over $3 million to her victims. The judge noted that her abuse of authority and violation of community trust warranted the maximum sentence allowed under federal guidelines. She was also permanently banned from serving in any HOA leadership position and required to register as a convicted cybercriminal. The Meadowbrook Estates community worked together to rebuild their HOA from the ground up. Mrs. Thompson was elected as the new president in a legitimate election that saw record participation from residents. The community implemented strict oversight procedures and hired a professional management company to handle finances and ensure proper governance. Marcus became an advocate for cybersecurity awareness in residential communities, speaking at neighborhood meetings and HOA conferences about the importance of protecting personal networks and recognizing signs of unauthorized surveillance. His experience had shown how quickly routine activities could become targets for criminals operating within trusted community organizations. The neighborhood also established a victim support fund to help residents who had suffered financial losses due to Patricia's identity theft activities. Many families discovered that their personal information had been compromised and needed assistance with credit monitoring and identity protection services. Several class action lawsuits were filed against Patricia and the HOA for the privacy violations and financial damages caused by the surveillance operation. The legal proceedings continued for years, but most victims eventually received compensation for their losses and emotional distress. The case prompted legislative changes in several states regarding HOA oversight and accountability. Lawmakers recognized that existing regulations were insufficient to prevent similar abuses of authority and passed new laws requiring regular audits, term limits for HOA officers, and mandatory cybersecurity training for community leaders. Marcus's story became a cautionary tale that was featured in cybersecurity training programs across the country. His experience demonstrated how criminals could exploit positions of community trust to commit sophisticated crimes against unsuspecting neighbors. The case study was used to train law enforcement officers about the warning signs of residential surveillance operations. The FBI created a special task force to investigate similar cases in other communities, using techniques developed during the Patricia Whitmore investigation. Agent Martinez led this effort and discovered that residential surveillance by HOA officials was more common than previously realized, leading to dozens of additional arrests nationwide. Marcus eventually became close friends with many of his neighbors who had supported him during the ordeal. The shared experience of surviving Patricia's surveillance operation had brought the community together in ways that normal neighborhood activities never could. Annual block parties now included cybersecurity workshops and discussions about protecting privacy rights. Mrs. Thompson proved to be an excellent HOA president, implementing transparent governance practices and regular communication with residents. Under her leadership, the community became a model for other neighborhoods dealing with HOA reform and accountability issues. Property values in Meadowbrook estates actually increased as word spread about the community's commitment to proper governance. Marcus's home security system, which he had upgraded significantly during the investigation, became unnecessary as the neighborhood was now one of the safest and most well-monitored in the city. The irony was not lost on him that Patricia's criminal activities had ultimately made the community more secure and vigilant about protecting residents' rights and safety. 3 years after Patricia's conviction, Marcus received a letter from her in prison. She had finally acknowledged the harm she had caused and expressed remorse for her actions. While Marcus appreciated the apology, he knew that the trauma she had inflicted on dozens of families would take much longer to heal completely. The surveillance equipment that Patricia had installed was completely removed and destroyed under FBI supervision. The community held a symbolic ceremony when the last of the illegal devices was eliminated, marking a new beginning for residents who could finally feel secure in their own homes again. Marcus continued to live happily in his house on Maple Street, having transformed a traumatic experience into an opportunity to protect others from similar crimes. His simple act of changing a Wi-Fi password had exposed a dangerous criminal and made his community safer for everyone. The neighborhood had learned that vigilance and community cooperation were the best defenses against those who would abuse positions of trust and authority. Years later, when new residents moved into Meadowbrook Estates, they were briefed about the importance of cybersecurity and community oversight. Marcus often volunteered to welcome newcomers and share his story, ensuring that the lessons learned from Patricia's crimes would protect future generations of neighbors. What had begun as the worst possible introduction to a new community had ultimately created one of the strongest and most secure neighborhoods in the entire city.